Thank you everyone for coming today. I appreciate you making the time to come along. And the whole purpose of today is we've been getting tons of questions from clinicians, from patients, from business owners around medical cannabis and this issue, stigma, question of like high THC and how that factors into the whole prescribing journey, into the theory of cannabinoid medicine and what that really means for getting the best outcomes for patients. And so what we thought we'd do is a bit of a zoomed out view of where this conversation around medical cannabis stands in the grand scheme of cannabinoid research and science, and what that means for you, whether you're a patient, prescriber, clinician, or business owner, or leader of a trade association. For anyone that doesn't know me, my background's basically in cannabinoid medical research and understanding just how phytocannabinoids in cannabis can be used therapeutically to target the endocannabinoid system in humans. So I was looking at inflammatory disorders of the gut, and then how that leads to colorectal cancer, and what exactly can we target in the gut, in the body, in cancers that will essentially neutralize those cancers, treat those illnesses, and what kind of chemical mechanisms can we push, what kind of bits of pharmacology, receptors can we target, and how do we essentially make the next generation of cannabinoid drugs for colorectal cancer treatments and inflammatory disorders. And so over the last couple of years, we've created an online research ecosystem for cannabinoid research, and gone out into the world, met all the smartest people I know in cannabinoid research and asked them to come and help with our cannabinoid venture here in the UK. So our company is all about cannabis science and then R&D and bringing that science to life and making it useful for people that need it, basically. And so for quite a long time, a lot of this research was kind of trapped in very boring medical articles. There's 30, 40, 50,000 articles out there on cannabinoid science. And so what we've done is turn that into a nice interactive ecosystem and try and bring that to life for the people of Britain and America and beyond now who are interested in this field. And yeah, please go for screenshots down there if you want to have if there's anything that flashes out to you that's helpful. And you can access all of that online through our online virtual science lab, basically. And in there, we've got 40 hours of cannabinoid lectures covering all sorts of topics, from grassroots harm reduction stuff for patients or members of the public, what happens in communities and schools, all the way through to advanced cannabinoid trainings on the endocannabinoid system in different diseases, and how clinicians can learn that at a faster pace than typically they'd have to read hundreds of articles, maybe try some trial and error along the way to kind of compile that, hours of conversations with colleagues, try and map it all out. And what we've done is digitize that and essentially put everything you'd learn and acquire and start understanding during a medical degree in cannabinoids and make that accessible and digital and faster and easier and nicer and simpler to learn for everyone. So it's interactive. You can ask questions in there, you can comment in there, we'll get back to you, and then we can give you little certifications, you can track your progress, and depending on who you are, what you do, you can then show this is evidence for your training requirements and other professional commitments as well. And so the reason we've put this presentation together today as well is that we've seen a lot of discussion around the uptake and the massive growth in medical cannabis prescribing. But just because the market's growing and more cannabis is being prescribed, that doesn't necessarily mean that patients are getting better health outcomes, that doctors know what they're prescribing fully, and potentially this could reflect and fall back very poorly on the cannabis industry as a whole if we're not anchoring it to solid science and transparent communication around the actual pros and cons and potential risks as well that we need to navigate. And so there's roughly 100 years worth of research for professionals, patients, business owners to catch up on, and we've digitized all that to make it as accessible and as interesting as possible. And so over the last couple of years, we've been doing a lot of discussions, trainings, engagements, and bits of analysis for groups that are prescribing cannabis in the UK at the moment. And so in around 2018, we had the law change that allowed for the prescribing of cannabis medicines in the UK as an unlicensed special medicine. And in the early phases, there was a couple of clinicians that were kind of doing all the prescribing, and still to this day, there's maybe 5 to 10 that have got 3 to 5 years kind of prescribing experience, having started their prescribing journey at the start of the sort of law change in 2018, 2019. And from that core group of prescribers, more and more newcomers are kind of coming into the ecosystem, whether that's new pharmacists, whether that's new doctors, nurses, and business owners. And what we found from our kind of analysis and surveying these clinics and healthcare teams is that most of them have under a year of experience. And of those that have had a year's worth of kind of first experiences, their first year of prescribing and interacting with these products, they've only really had about 5 hours of kind of quite light training on the topic. And so with this field being so vast and complex, there's a lot more nuance and there's a lot more depth of information that these healthcare providers need to be going into. And if you're a patient, oftentimes you might find that you're maybe more informed on your condition, how that condition alters the endocannabinoid system, than the person prescribing your medicines, and they maybe haven't had the time to go as in depth into your condition as you have. And so traditionally, if you wanted to go and learn all this research, you'd spend years at university, you'd then maybe do your master's thesis, your PhD, and you're looking at kind of like 6 years at least to be able to, at university, to be able to go through, assimilate all of this, start learning all of the different areas of the field, and read through hundreds, if not thousands, of research papers, taking up years of your life. And so what we've done is kind of condense everything that we've learned during our research degrees and during our work in the field of cannabinoids, and condense that down into accelerated training programs. And this webinar is kind of a condensed version of all those trainings that we've produced. And with high THC being the topic that we keep encountering and that cannabis naive members of the public are most interesting because they've heard this is kind of like a big taboo, stigma, danger, we wanted to do a bit of myth busting that people could kind of understand a bit more beyond the kind of hyper focus on high THC and THC as a compound, and show you just how vast and complex and interesting as well this kind of field of research and science is. And so one of the most interesting kind of reviews that have happened of the medical cannabis ecosystem recently was from the General Pharmaceutical Council. And I'm just going to go and steal the document for you guys so you can download it and have a read yourselves, because essentially what they've done is go and review all of the practices, the procedures, and the kind of quality standards at medical cannabis clinics and pharmacies around the UK, and come back with a bit of an analysis of what's going on and who's doing what. Do people actually do any training on these topics? Can they say reliably what each product does? Can they justify why they're prescribing those products and who those products are most useful to? And they found a lot of gaps in the processes, particularly around patients being prescribed cannabis and kind of unique formulations without the prescriber having had the full patient history. So they don't fully understand the patient. They haven't actually seen the patient a lot of the times. And that patient's being given a medicine based on not sure why, but it seemed like a good match. Maybe it's what we've got in the office, maybe it's what we've got in stock, etc. And so that's thrown up different issues. There have been different controversies around the medical cannabis clinics. And so there's so much science and data out there that these clinics could be using to kind of dispel a lot of those myths, neutralize a lot of those risks and concerns. And so this webinar is a bit of a mythbuster deep dive, but an overview still of all the different areas of the field that affect this kind of medical cannabis prescribing ecosystem that we're all a part of in different ways. And so I'm just going to I did put the link here in the chat. So it's quite a meaty report, but it's got some very insightful information in there. It gives you a very good insight into how these clinics and pharmacies are operating at the moment, where the weaknesses are, where the opportunities are, and what the industry could be doing better, basically. So what we've realized is that kind of access to these medicines is no longer the problem, and access to science isn't really the issue. Everyone can find it on the internet, but translating that data, translating those papers into something useful that people understand and can kind of wrap their heads around is really a bit of a sticking point at the moment. As you said, if you want to really go deep into this field, it's years of degree time, hundreds if not thousands of papers to read, and everyone's heard of THC and CBD. People have heard a bit about CB1, CB2, and some of these endocannabinoids, but what does all that mean when it comes to like a prescribing scenario, and how much of that's relevant to me if I'm prescribing cannabis, or if I'm a patient, or if I'm a business owner? What do I actually need to know in order to be able to operate in this field? And essentially we use this kind of like iceberg analogy, the cliche, and THC and CBD are really just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to conversation around cannabinoid science and research, and using cannabinoids, endocannabinoids, and synthetic cannabinoids as treatments for different diseases, and targeting the endocannabinoid system in different diseases, basically. And so we're going to do a bit of a run through of all of these different issues, topics, areas, and just give you a bit of a zoomed out view of the field, what you need to know, what's most important, so that either you can go deep dive yourself, have another read. We're going to have the references on the bottom of each of the slides. So if you want to go away and Google a little bit more, or read that full paper that we're extracting some of the images from, or some of the diagrams and data from, please, by all means, that's what it's there for. And we can answer any questions at the end as well if there's anything else that's popped up as we go along. So I think most people are pretty familiar with cannabis as a plant, and I think people are pretty aware of the terpenes that are in there, the phytocannabinoids that are in there. They understand that they exist, but they maybe don't understand the nuance and the complexity that occurs once you start putting those compounds into the body. And in total, beyond phytocannabinoids alone, there's 1,600 different compounds in cannabis. Each of those compounds has a very small effect on the person that we're giving that to and treating. Even within that soup of compounds, depending on which compound you're putting in the body, they kind of interact and alter each other as well. So when we're throwing or giving a patient a medical cannabis in a vaporizer, we really don't know what's going on pharmacologically. It's almost like carpet bombing. We're putting all these compounds in there and we're kind of hoping for the best in a way. It's not a precision treatment just yet, and it's very much almost being used in a supplemental way. And so I think one thing you may or may not be interested in is kind of the biosynthesis processes within cannabis that create the actual phytocannabinoids themselves, and the terpenes, the flavonoids, and the kind of interactive web almost of chemical synthesis that goes on inside the plant. That could, without a doubt, be a whole podcast, webinar, lecture on its own. And I wanted to kind of highlight this at the start because trichomes, plant science, and biosynthesis in plants, really just a whole vast world of chemistry. And why we started off with this is understanding that cannabis isn't just THC and CBD, it's 180 plus different phytocannabinoids. Then you've got the terpenes, then you've got the flavonoids, and then you've got all the other standard plant compounds that are inside the plant. And so it makes it very difficult from a pharmacological perspective to be able to say exactly what's doing what, how this strain varies from that strain, when we are putting in 180 different drugs essentially, at least, and we're trying to work out how that's going to affect our patient or affect our condition that we're targeting. And it's not just one type of phytocannabinoid as well. You've got the kind of raw acidic compounds that are there on the plant before it's transformed into anything. You've then got the activated phytocannabinoids as well. Those are the bioactive compounds that really do affect human health, and that's really the core set of compounds that have the psychological effects, the psychoactive effects, and the therapeutic effects. But the raw cannabinoid acids do also have therapeutic effects themselves, and a lot of exactly they all really stem from CBGA as like a mother cannabinoid, and they're all, I think the best analogy I've heard is it's kind of like a rock. You can break that rock into smaller pebbles and then smaller grains of sand still, and that's kind of the relationship between phytocannabinoids, terpenes, and flavonoids. They're all kind of like distillations of each other, and each of them have their own therapeutic effects as well. And the only reason we really focus on THC and CBD is that they're just the most well researched so far, and they've been the easiest to extract, they've been the easiest to test in the lab, and so that's why they've really got the most data on those two compounds. But again, we've got 180 other ones that we haven't really delved into, and it may be that some of those are more effective, maybe they're more potent in certain conditions. And we've also got these varin cannabinoids or cannabivarins, and they have it attached to the same receptor sites and binding sites in the body, but they have very different effects from the cannabinoid acids versus the activated decarboxylated phytocannabinoids as well. And so we've got phytocannabinoids as a class of their own, but then there's versions of phytocannabinoids within that umbrella. And so you've just got these vast seas of compounds that all have therapeutic impacts and all affect the body in every medical cannabis patient, but we don't know which compounds are doing what, or what the risks are, or which ones are the actual beneficial compounds. And so in this little graph here, I want to kind of illustrate the vast range of therapeutic effects that each of these phytocannabinoids have been found to have. And as a result of that, this is where we wanted to jump into the kind of endocannabinoid conversation, because I find a lot of clinicians are quite confused, and this is like medical cannabis clinicians and non-medical cannabis clinicians, so people that are maybe a bit more cannabinoid naive. They're very confused by the vast range of therapeutic effects that they hear around cannabis, and well, how can it treat cancers, or how could it have anti-cancer properties whilst also being anti-inflammatory and a bit of a anti-seizure medicine? Like, how's all that happening? And yes, the cannabis plant is very interesting, but what's more interesting and what opens up a whole new box of worms almost is the endocannabinoid system. So in this next slide, we're just going to have a quick look at just how many parts of the body that one cannabinoid can interact with. So can everyone see this slide okay? Because it's a little bit, well, it's quite detailed, and maybe some of the text's too small, but is everyone able to see it okay? So I'm not going to go in depth into like what TRP receptors are and 5-HT receptors, etc. But essentially, we hear about CB1 and CB2, but phytocannabinoids affect receptors right throughout the body. They affect opioid receptors. They affect some of the same receptor pathways that psychedelics do. So the 5-HT receptors, they're a big target for drugs like LSD and MDMA. And so some of these receptors have a wide range of effects, and we don't necessarily know what each receptor does fully, and it can vary between cells as to which receptor does what, depending on where it is in the body. So we've got CBG here, which was that like 10 different receptor targets that it's got, and in some cases it's activating those receptors, in some cases it's kind of blocking those receptors, or for some of them it's just partially activating some of them. And so what I think we underestimate as an industry is just how impactful each molecule is individually, but then also, well, if I put CBG, CBGA, and THC and CBD in together, do they all just affect the same receptor still? Not quite. They all then interact with each other and affect each other's efficacy. So if we have now a little peep at CBD, it's very much a similar scenario. And one thing that we found that medical cannabis trainings as a whole don't really help prescribers to interpret or understand is just kind of the vast pharmacology of how a single phytocannabinoid can affect and target a whole bunch of different receptor pathways, a whole bunch of different mechanisms within the body. Although I'm maybe giving this patient CBD for their epilepsy or for their arthritis, it's going to be affecting their gut, it's going to be affecting their skin, all these different pathways, their nervous system, their immune system. And this is one of the challenges with cannabinoid research, is that it's such a kind of like pluripotent, almost dirty molecule, because it doesn't, in traditional kind of like pharmacology and medicine, you have one drug and it targets one receptor and it does one thing. That's generally the theory behind pharmaceuticals and drug development. In the case of cannabinoids, one cannabinoid, CBD, can affect all of these different pathways. So if you're a drug designer, medical researcher trying to create therapeutics, it's like, well, I've got this compound that's got all these miraculous effects, but if I'm trying to give it to a patient and turn that into a repeatable medicine in a clinic or in a hospital, I can't reliably say what buttons it's going to push and what it's going to activate just yet, because it has such a vast range of effects. And so for the novel foods kind of conversations, I do understand their concerns as well, because obviously all of these compounds are drugs at the end of the day. They affect the body and they are all psychoactive. That's another bit of a myth. Although CBD isn't a full agonist at some of the CB1 receptors, it does still have anti-anxiety effects, which is by definition psychoactive effects. It's affecting the mind. So there's a lot of nuances and a lot of extra depth that the training programs haven't yet expanded into. And so what you'll find is that most clinicians, prescribers, pharmacists, nurses have heard that CBD binds to CB2, interacts with CB1, same for THC, but in reality, it's touching and interacting with everything. And that makes it a challenge, and it means that we've got to have a bit more nuance to the claims that we make and the decisions that we make medicinally in terms of prescribing. But there are ways around that, and we'll talk about some of the mitigations and extra things that we can sort of manipulate to get that same therapeutic impact. So THC and CBD kind of have these, and they're a good example to look at the relationship between cannabinoids, because THC binds to the same location as anandamide would, but not as powerfully as the naturally occurring endocannabinoid anandamide, and we'll go into this a little bit more. So THC binds at one site and CBD binds at another location, and if THC and CBD are in the same formulation, CBD is altering the effect of THC and THC is altering the effect of CBD. So when you've got medical cannabis, all of the compounds are modulating each other through all of these different receptor networks. So this is like a cascade of 100 times the complexity. And if you're, again, not really sure what mechanisms you're targeting in the patient for their condition or disease, it's really a lot of guesswork. And I don't think that the medical cannabis sector maybe appreciates how much guesswork's going into their prescribing. Beyond just the receptors, there's also this massive network of enzymes and also a bunch of other endocannabinoids that we're still discovering. You've got a group of receptors that are constantly kind of in flux, trying to balance and mediate the number of compounds that they're receiving. And then you've got the enzymes synthesizing and degrading those endocannabinoids to try and balance and match the levels to kind of the physiological requirements. And so the receptors, enzymes, and the endocannabinoids are in this kind of balancing act together right now, constantly in your body, trying to make sure that your internal environment is optimized and aligned with the external environment, and trying to keep all the cells happy, make sure they're all oxygenated, make sure they're not faulty or deficient in different ways. And so this balancing act between stimulation, receiving, degradation is kind of the ecosystem that we're manipulating with medical cannabis. But when we're prescribing medical cannabis, we're not entirely sure which of these buttons we're pushing, how we're affecting the enzymes that produce and degrade your natural endocannabinoids. And so we're going to be talking a little bit more about this endogenous ecosystem and what that means for being prescribed medical cannabis. And you can alter the endocannabinoid system without using cannabis at all, and I'll maybe touch on some of that at the end. But essentially, it's an ongoing balancing act. There's no standard concentrations for any of these either. So my baseline anandamide levels will be completely different from, say, well, from any of yours for the most part. And so if I'm prescribing, I need to be factoring in those endogenous kind of differences as well between my patients and between even patients with the same condition, depending on their size, age, gender. And so this is much more than a kind of THC, CBD, cannabis conversation. It's really endocannabinoid conversation for the most part. So these endogenous cannabinoids we have, or endocannabinoids, are also therapeutically beneficial. So they've managed to kind of calm different conditions, treat different conditions, alter the inflammatory markers, cause apoptosis in cancer cells. And so we're not just looking at medical cannabis and phytocannabinoids, but how can we also use endocannabinoids as kind of external drugs that we can use to supplement for people? And I guess it's a little bit like testosterone replacement therapy. If you're low in testosterone, I'll just give you more testosterone that we made in the biolab. Maybe too much weight gets placed on phytocannabinoids and cannabis, and this whole endogenous system is really the foundation of the whole industry. And most people in the industry really couldn't answer many questions about the endocannabinoid system beyond, oh yeah, well, your body produces endocannabinoids. But at a medical science therapeutic level, this is kind of like foundational to getting an actual therapeutic effect for the patient. So we're manipulating people's biology, but we don't really know how or why, and we're just kind of experimenting a lot of the time with patients, and they're experimenting on themselves almost with medical cannabis, trying to work out, well, is this the right strain for me? And it's really not a strain conversation either. It's, does your body even need endocannabinoids? Are you just not sleeping, or are you just not eating sufficiently as well? And so meeting the medical cannabis plant conversation with the biological human element is the balancing act that we should all be doing, and that the industry should be taking a look at as well. So as I mentioned, we've got these kind of three parts to the endocannabinoid system, and this is a very simplified table, and I'm going to show you the more intense table in a second. But by altering one of those elements, the other elements are going to alter to kind of counteract and balance that too. So it's very much a kind of scale, but three ways. Do we produce more endocannabinoids naturally, or do we need more receptors so that we're getting more endocannabinoids binding to those receptors to get more activation? Or do we inhibit the degradation enzymes to artificially inflate the amount of anandamide that's there? And so these are all kind of areas that synthetic cannabinoids are being investigated for. So you can make synthetic drugs that shut down the degradation pathways or block off the synthesis pathways. And this is kind of how we've worked out how these different parts of the endocannabinoid system all interact with each other. And this is just general medical research as to how we've investigated most of the body. And so this varies between every single person day to day. My endocannabinoid levels will be different before I go to bed versus when I wake up versus at lunchtime when I've had my big bacon sandwich or something. There's a lot that we can control in our bodies before we touch cannabis. And one of the key takeaways that we'll wrap up with at the end is medical cannabis is maybe a quarter of the therapeutic conversation when it comes to medical cannabis prescribing. And there's a lot of opportunity in making sure that patients are giving their bodies the best chance to be functioning properly as well before we add cannabis to the mix and start throwing in external compounds into the already quite intricate and delicate natural endocannabinoid system and natural kind of homeostasis. So shield your eyes. This is maybe say this is like 50% of the endocannabinoids that we've identified that we know at the moment. So again, if I'm giving a patient medical cannabis, I have no idea the knock-on effects of that medical cannabis prescription on all of these different elements of the human body. I can't say what happens when I put THC into someone's body, even if it's just THC as an isolated compound. We still don't know how that affects anandamide levels, 2-AG levels, PEA levels, what that does to the naturally occurring enzyme ratios, the activity of those enzymes. That's pretty risky at the end of the day. So again, I understand why the mainstream medicinal sector industry, NHS regulators are kind of standoffish about giving patients cannabis, because we literally haven't got a clue what happens when you put all of those compounds into the human body and how the human body is going to react to that. We also don't have a standardized kind of blueprint of what the endocannabinoid system looks like in a healthy person versus an unhealthy person versus in specific diseases. We're just kind of building up that portfolio of information at the moment, and a lot of that data is in rats, mice, dogs, some monkeys that have been forced to smoke cannabis as well in different ways, or injected with cannabinoids. So we've got absolutely tons of blind spots, and I think a lot of prescribers, healthcare professionals, particularly in the medical cannabis industry, not just in the UK, but in Australia, Germany, Canada and elsewhere, really don't appreciate how much of an effect they're having on someone's natural endogenous ecosystem. And you do see, and again, I go back to testosterone because I think the bodybuilding industry, or like the men's health industry at the moment, they're really pushing on, oh, well, we measure that your testosterone's a bit low today, so oh, you need to get on a dose of testosterone replacement therapy. And all that does is kind of, we don't have a big enough picture yet of what that one individual's testosterone's like through the day, or maybe they're having a bad week and it's a bit low this week. There's lots of things you can do naturally to optimize your body, make it healthier and get to those healthy levels of testosterone. But what ends up happening is we give the testosterone to those 40, 50, 60-year-old men, or even young men are taking it. They were like 20, 30, and they're absolutely destroying their own endogenous production processes and balances. And that's why I see bodybuilders that end up having to take, they ruin the body with steroids, and the body can't function without steroids. And we've kind of got a similar situation with medical cannabis, in that before a patient's had their endocannabinoid system optimized, or before we've looked too much into what they're doing to their body, we're giving them cannabis before we even know what the patient's doing. And we don't really understand the patient enough to be able to prescribe medical cannabis just yet. So what the General Pharmaceutical Council was finding and talking about is clinics, pharmacies, prescribers giving patients a cannabis product, and they've got no history on the patient. They haven't even seen the patient a lot of the time. So what they're doing to that patient's naturally occurring endocannabinoids is very intricate wiring. We really don't know. And I don't think enough people realize the kind of risk that we're opening up in that sense. The novel foods people are getting wound up about just CBD. Well, imagine if they knew what medical cannabis is going out into patients. And so this is just like the half of the tip of the iceberg at the moment with the endocannabinoids. There's goodness knows how many different receptors and signaling pathways that we're interfering with when we're giving patients medical cannabis. And then when you hear about the vast quantities, or you can have 100 grams a month if you want, or 400 grams a month, it's verging on reckless negligence. And a lot of companies probably don't want to know this information. They probably not wanting their doctors to know half of this information, because if they did know most of this, they would be far more hesitant to prescribe cannabis as liberally as it is being prescribed at the moment. Yes, it's harmless. Yes, and I say harmless, you can't overdose and kill yourself with cannabis, but you can severely alter, desensitize, and neutralize your own body's natural homeostatic systems, and yeah, potentially dysregulate yourself for life. And I think one final example on this point that I'll mention is spice and synthetic cannabinoids. So those are super potent binders to cannabinoid receptors, and they're so potent that they can burn and basically kill off your naturally occurring receptors. And so you see a lot of people that have taken spice or abused kind of synthetic cannabinoids back in the day who have tremors, they develop, like, basically develop Parkinson's, they have seizures, they have epilepsy. They're making themselves sick with cannabinoids because it's destroying their natural bodily functions. And that's the extreme side of things, but medical cannabis is in danger of potentially provoking that in patients if they're not fully aware or careful, or we're just not mitigating some of those risks. And these endocannabinoid system elements are in every cell in the body. So this is like your bones, it's in your joints, it's in your bladder, it's in your brain, reproductive system, testicles, ovaries, everywhere. And so when we're throwing medical cannabis compounds into this deeply sensitive web of biology, you're potentially damaging the reproductive system of your patients, you're potentially weakening their bones or damaging their bones in some way or stunting their growth. And the reality is we just don't understand how all of these medical cannabis compounds affect all of these endogenous signaling pathways and compounds too. So it's interesting that it's in every bodily fluid and every organ studied so far, down to your fingernail and nose. When we get the kind of questions, topics, and queries as to, well, how does cannabis, how can it help or treat epilepsy whilst also treating joint inflammation, whilst also treating muscle pain or healing wounds or treating cancer? Well, it's because these cells in this system's in every cell in the body. And so depending on which part of the body is affected or which condition you've got, a dose of those cannabinoids can support, neutralize, calm those different parts of the body. And so it's really, again, not a medical cannabis high THC, or we need, and the number of doctors that I see that are just rattling their heads around trying to work out, oh, well, is it the THC ratio? Oh, no, it's the terpenes. It's definitely the terpenes. Like, it's all of it. And you need to know about the elements in the body that you're actually targeting in order to be able to start making sense of all of this and start making logical, evidence-based decisions, basically. So in the gut, for example, endocannabinoids are also used by the body to speak to all the microorganisms in your gut. So you've got kilos of bacteria in your gut at any one time, and that sort of bacteria changes every month. So you've got kilos of bacteria going through your body every month, and your endocannabinoid system is responsible for maintaining the functionality of the gut tissue itself, but then also making sure that the human immune system isn't attacking the bacteria that are in your gut, because they're foreign bacteria basically that we live in symbiosis with. But then it's also got to make sure that it's kicking out the bad bacteria too. So it's at this kind of center of delicate homeostasis between gut function, the healthy bacteria, the bad bacteria, the digestive processes. And it's so delicate that a couple of nudges, or you eat the wrong meal, or you maybe drink too much alcohol, something like that, you end up with that whole system being completely imbalanced. And I've spoken to, well, I was looking at gut disorders as a condition for our research, and the number of people with Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, things like that, that affect these kind of three mechanisms, and they've got no reason for the diagnosis. It's, you've damaged that careful balance of homeostasis so much that it's going to be very difficult to be able to bring that back into kind of like balance again. And how you do that, you can maybe calm it, numb it with some cannabinoids, but I think the danger is that you damage the endocannabinoid system so much, either through kind of like your behaviors or through the drugs, that, I mean, people get given chemotherapy for Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, things like that. Once you've damaged some of those homeostatic systems, it's borderline impossible to get some of those back. Most of the questions you get about cannabis are really questions about the endocannabinoid system, and it's in every cell in the body. The dose, it's really got to be dialed into the individual. And again, you've got a grandma with Crohn's disease versus a young man with Crohn's disease, totally different treatment protocols. And a lot of the time, the clinicians that I meet, the nurses, pharmacists, prescribers, they're kind of stuck in a plant-focused question loop where it's like, oh, maybe we just get a different flavor of terpene, or we just get maybe it's the THC CBD ratio. And it's like, it's got nothing to do with any of that. You could change all those, you could give them every ratio. You don't understand the patient well enough to be able to say, oh, well, you just need a small amount of this, or you just need to stop drinking 100 units of alcohol every day, something like that. These kind of like small nuances are more important to the patient's health than the quality of the cannabis flower that you give them. Sure, you don't want the moldy tarnished cannabis, but going back to the general pharmaceutical kind of blind spots that prescribers are prescribing without even seeing the patient notes, you have no idea what you're giving to that patient, why, how, and what that's doing to them. And that's kind of the main issue that we want to address as a company, is that just helping the industry understand the endocannabinoid system more and what that means for the actual prescribing decisions. I'd argue that a lot of the patients in the medical cannabis prescribing ecosystem, you could probably get them better health outcomes without giving them cannabis, or delay the medical cannabis treatment 3 months till they've done XYZ. Do they drink water? Do they get enough nutrition? Do they just eat French fries every day? Do they just drink energy drinks, or they just don't sleep at all? All of those things would improve their health and endocannabinoid system and disease far more effectively than just giving them cannabis from the very start of the kind of intervention. So potency of cannabis isn't really the main danger here. It's kind of prescribing without understanding the patient or the endocannabinoid system that we're targeting. Every compound in cannabis has therapeutic potential. We just haven't investigated all these compounds properly yet. And we very much only just understand THC and CBD ish, and we still don't understand what happens when you put those compounds into the body fully. And then again, the dose, it's very much keeping it unique to the individual and what they need. We're probably 2/3 of the way through, so I'll maybe rattle through some of the last bits and we can have a bit of discussion if that sounds good to everyone. To the THC point, THC is basically a half activator of the naturally occurring endocannabinoids in our body. So what it's kind of doing is mimicking and stimulating some of those pathways that might be maybe dwindling or weakened because of a reduction in the amount of anandamide or 2-AG that's available to the body. And so when that kind of ratio of endocannabinoids is kind of dropping below that homeostatic baseline that's required for optimal health, that's when we start getting different disease conditions. And so THC is this almost like a bit of an exogenous supplement, external supplement that we're trying to put into the body to mimic the naturally occurring endocannabinoids. And it's the same for it's the same for basically all of the phytocannabinoids in cannabis. They're just a plant-based almost replacement for maybe what's lacking endogenously. And it's tickling all those same buttons, but not in the same way that your naturally occurring endocannabinoids do. I'm going to touch on a couple of little downstream effects of what that means for just maintaining actual bodily function of like your natural levels. What ends up happening is that we maybe don't get the effect we want, or we end up using maybe too highly concentrated cannabinoids, and it ends up damaging again that kind of like natural baseline of endocannabinoids that we have, and it becomes a bit of almost a desensitization process or tool. And so your natural levels will end up diminished, similar to how if you're giving someone testosterone that maybe doesn't need it. Everyone's heard the stories about bodybuilders' testicles. Your body stops producing testosterone naturally. And maybe Lara hasn't heard about the testicles as much as I have, but that ends up diminishing in naturally occurring levels, and you do end up almost needing a bit of a tolerance break so that can replenish. I saw Jane mention that as well, which is really, again, something that I don't know how well that's factored into the clinical procedures at the moment too. Now, there are a number of different kind of balancing acts that need to take place between not affecting the natural levels and still getting a therapeutic effect, but then finding an appropriate dose that doesn't then stray into like a toxic dose as well. So I made a little post about this the other day. Basically, once you get past a certain amount of phytocannabinoid, THC, CBD, etc., it can then start having the opposite effect of what you want. So it may be inflammatory to start, or anti-inflammatory to start with at small to lower doses. But once you get past that threshold, it kind of tips the system, and your body kind of almost then thinks it's being oversupplied with the naturally, and it's getting overstimulated basically. And so your natural levels will either suffer or end up dwindling. And that can then stray into a kind of like toxic scenario where if you've got too much THC and your body can't handle it, you're then doing more damage. You're actually damaging that kind of very delicate ecosystem, potentially making the disease symptoms worse as well. So I've got a little example here of animal models of the gut. They were looking at, okay, can we use THC to produce an anti-inflammatory effect in inflamed gut? Yes, we can. But then once we nudged it into a higher chronic dose and repeated administration, it's not just a one-off. Usually when we're looking at a study or doing some kind of research, it's here's the dose, here's what happens after. But if it's repeated doses constantly and it's too high, that actually ends up becoming an inflammatory signal, and the body goes, oh, this is kind of like getting way too much now, and it ends up damaging what would be considered normal and flipping it into a disease creating scenario. So for patients that are then going through some of these high medical cannabis doses that are, oh, I need 400 grams a month or 100 grams a month of I need the highest THC possible, you're then actually theoretically, potentially harming that patient and making their symptoms worse. So if you've got someone with a gut condition who's on a low dose of cannabinoids and they get a therapeutic effect, they'll feel great and their gut health's getting better. They don't have the same kind of like gastric pains. They don't have the same like hypermotility and having to go to the bathroom so much. Whereas if you then tip that into a high dose and too many cannabinoids, that's when you see, again, you recreate the same disease conditions and scenarios. So you go back to the, oh, well, I've got gastric pain again now. Oh, well, my symptoms have come back is often what patients say. And it's because you flip the switch too far, you've crossed that therapeutic threshold, and now you're into a almost damaging threshold where it's become a toxic dose. And there's been, I mean, there's a million different cases that you can kind of Google for this, but I think cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome is a good example. That is almost like self-inflicted health conditions then. And you do see it for pain conditions as well, where once you get past a certain dose, the pain comes back and it actually becomes more painful because however the wiring's worked, you end up kind of overstimulating the pain receptors again. But from what was therapeutic soon then becomes too much. And it's like most things you put in the body, water. Enough water hydrates you, too much water kills you, or you end up with a hyperhidrosis, or same with caffeine. A good bit of caffeine, maybe that helps make you feel better, but too much caffeine, oh, I'm gonna feel sick and I want to get rid of it. And we need to be treating medical cannabis in more of this kind of way. And so to add a bit more, I mean, this is a bit of a summary now of those intermolecular alterations. Cannabinoids alter and change the effect and modulate each other. So THC, CBD modulate each other, CBG can modulate those three, and then you've got seeds of compounds, they're all modulating each other as well. So you're getting all these like micro modulations and you don't really know what's affecting what then again. You've then got the terpenes, which alter the effectiveness as well of these phytocannabinoids. There is a lot of weight put on terpenes. I think most of them are therapeutic in themselves. You could probably treat a patient with just terpenes, honestly, rather than cannabinoids as well. But that hasn't been quite thoroughly investigated. It's hard to stabilize terpenes because they're quite aromatic and they just vaporize on their own. And then for flavonoids, there's a little bit of research into those, but they're also very small compounds and hard to extract from a plant. So although a cannabis plant may be rich in flavonoids, the chemical processes that you need to be able to extract those flavonoids oftentimes destroys the flavonoids. So we're kind of in a bit of a sticky situation in that it's almost as though we need to go back to that one therapeutic compound at a time process of, well, we're just going to give this patient THC isolate to start with, or just a pure CBD gel gummy, and then maybe we add CBG in later, or whatever it is, depending on their endocannabinoid system or their condition and what variations we see in those conditions. And so, although there is a bit of a discussion around the entourage effect, it is noticeable, it is important. There are conditions where if you just give a patient CBD alone, maybe they get a little beneficial effect. But if you give them a whole cannabis plant or a whole full spectrum dose, then maybe that symptom's affected more positively and they get a better therapeutic effect. But that's when you start straying into, well, we then don't know what's doing what. And that's kind of the issue that most pharmaceutical companies, pharmaceutical development, and doctors have with giving cannabis as a whole to patients. There's 180 different phytocannabinoids that we've discovered so far. There's probably going to end up being more that we encounter. And we could be a lot more selective and probably cautious with what we are giving to a patient based on their actual unique circumstances. And the medical cannabis industry has almost become the pharmaceutical industry that a lot of those companies, groups propose to try and like replace. You're still not looking at the patient. You still really haven't investigated the patient whatsoever, and you're prescribing blindly a lot of the time. And that was the main criticism with, and the main reason people leave the NHS and come to a medical cannabis clinic is that they think, oh, well, I'm getting a treatment that isn't available on the NHS. Well, you are, but you're not getting any extra investigation into you and your unique therapeutic requirements as a patient. And I think that's maybe one area where we're becoming a little bit hypocritical as an industry, or for medical cannabis industry. So we've talked about the variation in plant compounds and the variation in the endocannabinoid system, but then we also need to think about the drug delivery. And so depending on how we consume, prescribe, or introduce that drug into the patient, we're going to get completely different doses that actually end up where you want them. So this is another big challenge with cannabinoid research, is how do you get the drugs effectively to the site in the body that you actually want to treat and deliver therapy to. What we do at the moment, for the most part, with the medical cannabis industry, is you just inhale it and it goes everywhere, all throughout the body, hits your brain, hits your fingers, hits your knuckles, hits your skin, etc. But if we want to get into more precision drug treatments and actually evolve as a sector, we can't keep going for that carpet bombing approach. Again, sure, it helps short term and maybe you can get a short term effective relief, but long term, the damage that you're potentially doing, or you don't know what damage you're doing really, because it's just 180 cannabinoids, 1,600 compounds thrown into my body. I feel better for now, but what are the long-term effects of that? And how's that affecting my natural baselines? What's that doing to my organs? What's that doing to my ovaries and reproductive system? And I have encountered a couple of questions from clinicians as well that come into these medical cannabis clinics of, well, how does that affect I want to have a baby. Is this going to affect my ability to get pregnant? Is this going to affect my childbirth? Is this, I've got a kid and I breastfeed. Is that going to, am I going to get my kids high with my cannabinoid consumption? So that's another challenge that we need to be considering. There are ways around it, but I think a lot of this points towards we need more developed, more precise pharmaceutical grade formulations for certain diseases, as opposed to falling on our kind of laurels and just saying, well, medical cannabis cures everyone. It's, well, short term, yeah, you can get an effect and they'll be high, so they'll be pretty happy, really, for the most part. But we've also got to consider maybe topical treatments, where those could be better for someone that's got arthritic pain. Could we just be rubbing it on their joints directly rather than a full systemic dose of cannabinoids? And then as well, orally, could we maybe wrap those kind of compounds or encapsulate those in a different kind of nanoparticle that makes it easier to absorb, so it goes to the right part of the body, to the gut, to the liver, depending on what you're trying to target. And so I think one thing that is pretty gets lost on people is this kind of like journey of how cannabinoids move through the body. So it's a process. The body's kind of like a filtration system, and it keeps what it wants, sends what it wants around the body, and then the rest of it excretes out. And I haven't tested this. I haven't collected the urine samples of too many medical cannabis patients, but I would posit a guess a lot of what they're consuming is being excreted out and not actually being used by the body as well. So a lot of the patients that are doing the high doses, oh, I have such a high tolerance, I need this, I need 10, 15 grams a day or whatever. Their body probably just doesn't want it. It had too much, it's oversaturated, and it's just going, oh, get that straight out. We're not even going to bother processing that because we're going to get another kilo of it tomorrow and another kilo of it tomorrow. Maybe those people just need a small dose and they'd feel way better than they would if they were on 30 grams a day or 50 grams a day. You know what I mean? Certain amount gets excreted, a certain amount gets stored in your fat, also stored in like muscles, comes out in your sweat, your saliva, gets stored in your hair. So again, it's not this binary process of give cannabis, THC works magic, it stays there and does exactly what you want it to do. It goes right throughout the body. So if you put a bit of, it's like a cocktail mixing. If you put a bit of gin in a small amount of juice, maybe not so strong, but if you start putting more gin in there every time or stronger doses of gin, you're quickly going to end up with a very strong drink, and the body just holds on, reposits, and keeps a lot of this. And again, you can actually damage your liver with cannabinoids in certain circumstances. There are instances where there are kind of like increased kind of inflammatory markers in livers. It's being tested in different kind of like in vitro, in vivo scenarios. So they'll give mice a high dose of cannabinoids and they'll kill it at the end, test its liver and see just how damaged its liver was. And I've seen ones where they've given a mouse alcohol and they've given a mouse CBD, and what does its liver look like with just alcohol? What does it look like with just CBD? And interestingly, it does seem that CBD exacerbates the effects of alcohol in some circumstances, in some animals, and then in other cases, it's reduced the impact of the alcohol on the person or the individual. So going back to that biphasic effect, it can be therapeutic, but at a certain dose, it can be toxic. And if you're combining then alcohol with caffeine, I mean, if you're combining your cannabinoids with caffeine or alcohol or other drugs, you're also then potentially flipping it into other areas. And I think this is where, again, if you're prescribing to a patient and you haven't got their patient history, maybe they're taking a medicine that really doesn't agree with cannabinoids. And there are a few where you can get very serious liver damage from mixing cannabinoids, cannabis, THC with blood thinners or psychiatric medicines and things like that. And so again, the dangers of prescribing without understanding, like I haven't even read the patient case history of the patient. That's insane. So for a patient to be able to understand how these molecules move through their body as well is pretty fundamental to having, actual therapeutic response to these medicines. And so broken it down slightly here into things we need to consider. So we've got our baseline genetic makeup of what our body would normally look like healthily in an individual. What does my baseline look like? You've then got the diet, the BMI, the lifestyle of that individual. So baseline genetically, they're fine, but they've put on a large amount of weight. Now they're heavily obese. That's going to affect the functionality, the dosing, the impact of the medicines, other physiological problems that are going to be going on inside that body, because their organs are under stress if their BMI is too high. And maybe they've come in with arthritis or fibromyalgia. There's a lot of other organ systems that medical cannabis treatment is going to be affecting beyond the fibromyalgia and the pain. It's going to be affecting, again, the liver, gut, kidneys, reproductive system. And then it very much depends on the condition that the patient's coming to you with, because different conditions seem to have different endocannabinoid alterations. And depending on those alterations, that kind of requires a different formulation or a different approach to that condition as well. So we're looking like variables, another group of variables, and another group of variables further still. So these are kind of like the key myths that I would redirect people to think more about the endocannabinoid system around. I constantly hear patients and doctors coming to us going, oh, well, this patient just wants more THC. Well, if they're not having an effect at the already high dose they're on, more THC is only going to make it worse and potentially open up more risks. I do see a lot of doctors also just looking at THC levels. Oh, well, they're only on a 15%. Maybe I'll move them up to a 20%. Yeah, but there's 180 other compounds. It's not just the THC ratio or the concentration of THC in the sample or in the batch of cannabis that you're giving them. There's the ratios of all the other compounds you need to think about. And then again, I constantly see this in the clinics is THC and CBD ratios. That's all oftentimes it's on the product that the patients receive. They don't know anything else about that product other than it's a 2-to-1 THC to CBD. What does that even mean? It means nothing. It doesn't tell you anything. It's like a tip of the iceberg snapshot of what's maybe in there, but tells you nothing about the 99% of the other compounds that are in that cannabis sample. So dangers upon dangers, basically, at this point, and just blind spots all over the place. Things to be considering then are, firstly, the product, what's in that. Ideally, you've got a nice certificate of analysis that says all the different cannabinoids that are in there. I'm yet to really see that in the majority of medical cannabis clinics. You might get one when they shake the hands and they make the purchase of a large amount or a large batch of cannabis, but then when it comes down to what actually ends up in that patient sample, very little idea. We then need to have a bit of a think about, well, what information is the prescriber prescribing based on? Do they know about, have they got protocols? Have they got a nice patient history that they can look into and kind of, oh, well, that eliminates this. We shouldn't be looking at that kind of formulation, or we shouldn't be giving this patient cannabis at all. They've got all these issues. And then the patient themselves, like, what state of health are they at the moment? What have they already tried? What are they already taking? What's their lifestyle like? That is a huge factor. Just going down to like the types of fat you eat. If you're eating that kind of omega-6, heavily processed, oily food, that is immediately damaging most of your body and creating a bit of a toxic environment. Whereas if you're on the omega-3, you're eating olive oil and you're eating these nice salads and lovely oily fish, that's completely different to your doner kebab fat. Just the ratio of omega-3 to omega-6 completely alters your levels of endocannabinoids, your receptors, and your enzyme functionality. So again, what we think oftentimes is a medical cannabis THC conversation is very much the endocannabinoid system. And so obviously this is quite a lot of information to process, and I'm not sure how many medics we've got on here. Yeah, we'll quick look. I think Icarus had to jump out, who's the pharmacist. So we have actually come up with a bit of just a simple step process for what to be looking at in each patient. And I've created a bit of an app to score patients before you prescribe them cannabis. Like, how's your sleep? What's your diet like? How much water do you drink every day? Are you meeting all the good guidelines for like alcohol consumption? How many units of alcohol do you have each week? We need to have better processes that are more endocannabinoid system focused for this whole prescribing setup. There are countless issues that could be eliminated, countless inefficiencies, the amount of wasted money, prescriber time, internal time that could be eliminated just from having some of these simple baseline criteria that we're walking patients through. We've got the generic criteria and we've got the generic processes that will give us your patient information. You've got to try 2 medications beforehand, but if we still don't follow basic principles from the field of endocannabinoid medicine, you might as well just be making it up. Well, you're making it up as you go along, basically, and that's why we have a lot of the problems that we do. Now, obviously, there are a lot of gaps at the moment. People can jump from clinic to clinic. They've maybe found something they want at one clinic that isn't available at another clinic, or at one pharmacy that's not available at another pharmacy. Maybe patients just want to be able to have more choice, and maybe they're not too worried about what kind of cannabis they're consuming or what their endocannabinoids saying. They just want cannabis. I think this is where the wiggly line of ethics kind of comes into it. Are we here to dispense cannabis to patients and give them what they want, or are we here to give good, solid, evidence-based medicine that isn't accessible through the NHS. And I think because we're in this kind of pseudo, well, it's becoming a pseudo dispensary model, I'd argue, for a lot of the medical cannabis. When you're prescribing to patients and you haven't even seen the patient history, or you've seen them for 5 minutes, there's no way on this earth that you can be able to justify or tell me what's going on inside that patient. You've got no clue. That's what you probably don't want to admit. And so are we meeting demand, or are we, as doctors and clinicians and healthcare professionals, trying to just deliver good safety first, science first healthcare following basic scientific principles? And so this is the challenge with the sector, really, is we're kind of, there's a jostle between, oh, well, I like the name of that strain, or that one smells nice, versus, well, you've got arthritis, or you've got cancer, or you've got epilepsy. That's not, it might smell great. It's a beautiful plant, but that's not what your body needs. And that's not what the science indicates would be useful for you. And so a couple of things we've come up with now as like a company and as an organization that we've made available to everyone. We've come up with a scientific literacy program for teams, nurses, doctors that are trying to encounter this. It's an hour and a half. You can do it in a day. You can do it overnight. You can do it at lunchtime. And it just starts building those levels of competency and understanding. We've also developed a quite in-depth clinical training program for endocannabinoid science, so you understand what endocannabinoid system elements are altered in which diseases. PTSD is very different from anxiety, which is very different from depression. They've all got different cannabinoid alterations. And at a business level, if you don't understand this field, you are purely guessing with your money, with your investors' money, with your company's time, with your company's credibility, company's reputation. We've already seen a few bad cases where something's happened to patients that shouldn't have happened. And how many more instances do we need? How many more companies going bust do we need? How many faulty medicines, moldy medicines do we need to be prescribed? And how many patients? I mean, I see a lot of patients coming through companies and they're there for 1 or 2 prescriptions, then they go somewhere else. Like, how do you actually retain patients and actually give them a nice healthcare journey as well? Plugging all this into these private clinics, into these ecosystems and the processes is another part of the journey. So what we've come up with is, and what we've evolved into, is this virtual cannabinoid research lab where we act as a university for your team, so we can train them all up. We also act as a science department that's on hand to answer any questions, help you solve some of the problems that come into the clinic, come up with tools and design resources for you. We can do R&D if you want to develop snazzy products and actually do some hardcore research in some cells, in some animals, do some testing. We've automated, tracked, digitized all of this. So you've got all the clinical governance, you've got all the legitimacy, you've got all the evidence that you need. You've got an AI, so it's available 24/7. And we're on hand to help make sure all of this slots into the companies, the businesses, the business planning efficiently. What's the point of starting a business and trying to like recreate the science in your own way? But like having I've got a Formula One team, but I'm going to tell the engineers what I want them to do, as opposed to the engineers find out the very best way to make that car go as fast around the track as possible. Yeah, but I want a pointy rocket on the front of it. Or I want this really big, I want the wheels to be bigger. I want the exhaust to be bigger. It's like, well, none of that helps the engineering of the race car. You're just making it look stupid. So same goes for all the companies, all the clinics. That I'm amazed half of them haven't been shut down, and I'm amazed that there haven't been more accidents, to be honest, and there haven't been like some big lawsuits, frankly. Tons of evidence out there, and we've just tried to make it as easy as possible for everyone to access all of that. It's free for the public, and here for all of you guys as colleagues and partners. And basically what we're offering to the cannabis industry, to cannabis companies, is we are your R&D science team, science division, and we act as a lab for you. Private space with us. We'll help you, coach you, train the teams, get everyone up standards. We can give you all certificates, make you all look professional and like you know what you're doing. And get better outcomes for the patients ultimately. So it's a pretty delicate balance, and we just want to make sure that everyone's got access to the best information. There's tons of free stuff for mums and dads, of course, for patients too, Jane. Once you log in, there's about 7 hours of free trainings on everything from consumer information, CBD products, harm reduction in the communities, or what's in cannabinoid smoke, what's mold, why do we need to worry about mold, what are pesticides, what are heavy metals, what are all those, all the way up to hardcore cannabinoid research and endocannabinoid system profiling for clinicians to be able to diagnose and prescribe better. So we just want to make sure that the best companies have access to the best science and they're able to lead the industry by example, as opposed to making up guesses as they go along and make a bit of a hash of things. So if you'd like a digital cannabinoid research team back in your business, let us know. But it's free for everyone. That's the best place to start, and email me anytime. Yeah, I think everyone's got my email address, but I'll put it in the, I'll write in the chat now for us, so you can just drop me an email. Yeah, we've got stuff for blooming everyone, basically. So it's just making sure it gets turned into useful stuff and actually has like an impact for patients and for businesses in the industry. So that brings me to the end of my slightly over time presentation. Global Cannabinoid Solutions helps organizations replace guesswork with scientific clarity. We translate decades of global cannabinoid research into a digital science ecosystem, a structured environment where teams build literacy, reduce risk, and move towards defensible clinical and executive decision making. The result? Organizations that act with confidence, scale with integrity, and build credibility in one of healthcare's most complex domains, cannabis.